This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Voting is underway in Botswana's hotly contested elections. Moscow seeks a stronger cooperation with Africa at Russia-Africa Summit in Sochi. And thousands are homeless from flooding after a river burst its banks in the CAR's capital, Bangui. This is a CGTN. Welcome to Africa Live with me, Beatrice Marshall, in Nairobi. Also coming up on the program. In your business news, the Brexit deal is on hold as UK lawmakers disagree on the timetable. And former Proteas skipper AB de Villiers remains optimistic despite a series whitewash against India. And we begin in Botswana, where voting is underway for the country's general election. Voters will elect a 57 National Assembly and 490 local government representatives. The president will then be chosen by the National Assembly for a 5-year term. The ruling Botswana Democratic Party has led the country for almost 5 decades since the country's independence in 1966. The umbrella for the democratic change is now hoping to unseat the BDP of President Mokgweetsi Masisi. It is backed by former President Khama, who handed over to Masisi last year. The winner of the top seat in the country faces the challenge of diversifying the economy that mainly relies on diamonds, as well as continuing the fight against corruption.
I'm hoping that the candidate that will win will be able to come up with policies that will improve our lives and the policies that will take Botswana to a better future.
The person that I elect is able to manage and eradicate corruption. So yes, that's what I'm hoping for.
Well, let's cross over now to CGTN's Lindy Mtongane. She's in Gaborone, the capital of Botswana. Lindy, can you bring us up to speed with what is going on there at the moment? Can you give us an update on the voting process so far?
Well, it is 12 o'clock, or just after 12 o'clock midday here in Botswana, and voting is well underway. Of course, just over 900,000 people registered to vote in the 2,260 polling stations across the country. We are at one of those polling stations, that's Masialele Primary School in Moshopa. Now, this town is about 60 kilometers just west of the capital, Gaborone, and it is the hometown of the President, Mokgweetsi Masisi. He is expected to arrive here to cast his vote in the company of his mother and his wife, and it's expected that he should arrive here shortly. Meanwhile, voters, of course, have been gathered here for many hours already. It is a hot day, so some, of course, gathered behind the trees behind me for a little bit of shade. And we did speak to the spokesperson of the IEC for a bit of a broader picture of what is happening around the country. We're told that voting is progressing smoothly, though it has been a bit of a slow start, but of course we're told now that it is picking up momentum. One incident we've been told about involves a man who did not find his name on the voters' roll in a place called Mahalapia East, and this was in a small ward called Boseja. This affects the local city government elections in that particular ward. They've made the decision to postpone that poll, and this again just affects the local city council election there. So this has no bearing whatsoever on the election for the members of parliament. A full update by the IEC will be given to the press a little later this afternoon, and we'll be able to update you further after that.
Well, Lindy, it is a slow start, as you mentioned there, for that election. 260 polling stations. Do we know when the polls will close? For how long will voting go on for?
Well, Beatrice, polling officially, or the poll stations will officially close at 7 p.m. this evening. What that means in a place like this, for instance, is that the gates will be closed, but anybody that is still within the polling station itself will be allowed to cast their ballot. Thereafter, at about 7:30, we expect the IEC, the Independent Electoral Commission, to just give us an update on the closure of polling stations throughout the country, as well as the transportation of ballot materials to counting centres at about 9 o'clock this evening. That is the official time at which the IEC will announce the beginning of the counting of votes. That will take place throughout until the final results are announced, and that is expected to be within the very most within 2 days. So by Friday, we should know who the next president of Botswana will be.
All right, Lindy Mtungana for us there in Gaborone in Botswana. Well, let's now cross over to neighboring South Africa, where Gideon Chitanga, a regional political economist at PESA, a political economic think tank, is joining us live from Johannesburg. Gideon, Botswana is one of Africa's model democracies. It is a stable economy, and now Botswana's first close election contest since independence. How significant are these elections for that country?
I think that these elections are very important, more so in the sense that it's for the first time that the BDP is facing a real threat to its power. So the opposition alliance has a huge opportunity to win in these elections. I think that the democratic institutions would be put to a real test, and as well as the political willingness to allow a winner to peacefully take power if in the opposition won. So we are staring at a situation where the half a century developing democracy is going to be tested in terms of facilitating a smooth transition and political change if the opposition were to win for the first time in the history of Botswana.
So the ruling PDP is facing a real threat from the opposition this time around. The PDP has been ruling that country since independence in 1966. Botswana, though, is a relatively stable economy. What issues are likely to decide this election?
It's very interesting that the collection of issues that the political figures are dealing with, key political figures and parties are dealing with, are basically similar. And I don't see much differences in the policies that are being profiled around issues of reducing unemployment, which is at 20%, dealing with the growing problem of inequality, which is centered around the mining economy, and having an elite that is linked to politics and the mining economy accumulating faster than the ordinary people who are left outside. Of late, we have been hearing a lot about corruption within the state. The former president of Botswana is also implicated or accused by, was accused by the opposition when he was in power for being corrupt. But a huge issue is the personality and policy differences between the former president, Khama, and his successor, Masisi, which has divided the BDP. And given that Khama is a member of the traditional authority, is a chief who has much influence around central Botswana, the split between BDP and the faction that follows Khama under the Botswana Patriotic Front could be a decisive factor in the electoral outcome, and possibly a decisive factor in the policy trajectory going forward after the elections.
All right, Gideon Chitanga joining us there from Johannesburg. Thank you. And now to Russia's Black Sea resort of Sochi, where the first ever Russia-Africa summit is ongoing. The host, President Vladimir Putin, has met with his Egyptian counterpart, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. The two have pledged to develop economic cooperation. Dozens of African leaders are also attending the two-day summit. It highlights Russia's significant milestone in ongoing outreach projects to the African continent. President Putin is hoping to gain an edge on commercial opportunities in Africa. The continent has massive economic and political potential, as well as abundant natural resources. But poverty, political instability, and a poor infrastructure hobbles the continent's potential. According to Putin, the summit will focus on African solutions to African problems. Participants will also discuss ways to develop joint solutions and how to further cooperation. Right, let's now cross over to Sochi for the latest. CGTN's Julia Chapman is standing by for us. Julia, it's been a busy morning in Sochi. Can you give us more details on the summit and what is being discussed today?
Well, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, held his plenary session this morning, speaking to the delegates that have attended this Russia-Africa forum here in Sochi. He was speaking with his co-chair of the summit, the Egyptian president Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, and the two of them, in their respective speeches, spoke at length about what the opportunities are between Russia and Africa. Russia, of course, has been increasingly interested in the African continent as it tries to fill what it sees as a void left by U.S. influence, as the U.S. under Donald Trump has shown a little respect and attention really to the African continent. That's what Vladimir Putin says. He was hailing trade increasing between Russia and the continent, but he did say that it has a long way to go. Russian-African trade only amounts to around $20 billion a year, which still pales in comparison, of course, to China and to the US and the European Union. So President Putin very keen to emphasize that he would like to improve trade, and that's definitely going to be on the agenda as he meets more individually with some of the African leaders today and tomorrow.
Well, Julia, President Putin is also going to have bilateral talks with some African leaders on the sidelines of the summit. We do know that he has already met with Egyptian President el-Sisi. Can you give us details of that meeting?
Yes, we have heard that the two of them have been meeting. He's also been meeting a number of other leaders already as the summit gets underway today. With regards to Egypt, Egypt is Russia's largest trading partner in Africa by far. Egypt accounts for 40% of Russia's trade with Africa, so a hugely disproportionate number there. Russia certainly trying to improve that balance and do more trade with a number of other countries, including and especially in sub-Saharan Africa. But of course, they were discussing ongoing nuclear projects between Russia and Egypt, as well as a number of other things, including a economic zone between the two countries. He's also been meeting, President Putin has been meeting with the South African President Ramaphosa. The two of them have been discussing bilateral ties, economic cooperation, trying to grow that as well as Russia looks to further the cooperation with South Africa through the BRICS format, as well as a number of other areas economically.
All right, Julia Chapman joining us there from Sochi in Russia. Thank you. Well, Russia's interests in Africa are in trade and security. CGTN's Robert Nagila examines Russia's growing influence on the African continent.
In the past decade, Russia recorded a 350% increase in trade with Africa. By 2018, trade with sub-Saharan Africa had peaked at $20 billion. Much of Russia's key investments on the continent are in oil, gas and the nuclear sectors. In 2015, Russia signed a $25 billion agreement with Egypt to build its first nuclear power plant by 2026. Several Russian energy companies, mostly state-owned like Gazprom, have energy interests in Algeria, Angola, Nigeria and Uganda. Another area the superpower has interests in is Africa's mineral sector. Russia has already signed a $4 billion deal with Zimbabwe to develop the world's largest deposits of platinum. The country also has mining interests in Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Namibia and the Central African Republic. Security is another area of cooperation Russia will be seeking. Already, it is the largest arms supplier in Africa and has pursued military ties with Ethiopia, Nigeria and Zimbabwe. In the Central African Republic, Moscow has a team of military advisors training the country's army. At least 40 African leaders and about 3,000 business representatives are expected to attend the two-day summit in Sochi. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Well, let's broaden this discussion further, and I'm joined by Professor Patrick Bond. He's a political and economic analyst from the School of Governance at the Wits University in Johannesburg. Professor, what's driving Russia's interest in Africa at this point?
Well, thanks for having me. Yes, it's fascinating because this is a critical period because Donald Trump may only be in office for another year and a few months. And so if Vladimir Putin wants to consolidate this extraordinary new geopolitical power, diplomacy, and having 54 friends in the United Nations who could support him in the Security Council now that Syria and the Ukraine are in such tense situations. But also, as your correspondent said, there's a lot of material interests ranging from arms sales, where Africa is the main is a major customer, but also diamonds and platinum, oil. In this country, even steel was a major investment by a Russian firm, which then went bankrupt. So there's also the question of geopolitics in which micro intervention occurs. So Central African Republic, and allegedly even in the South African election there have been some Russian fingerprints. So it's a wide variety, and maybe most importantly right now is the nuclear sales, including once again a pitch to South Africa.
So there is a military, there is a trade, and there is a security component to Russia's interest in Africa. Perhaps we should be asking, what is in it for Africa? Because Russia has offered African leaders no strings attached business and protection from Western pressure.
Well, we don't know if it's really no strings attached. For example, if you say, what's in it for Africa, you're right to specify it's the leaders. But don't forget that when the leaders, Jacob Zuma, who recovered from poisoning in Moscow in 2014, along with our present deputy president, Mabuza, along with a top politician, Willie Mkunu, they were poisoned and they got better. So the relationship between leaders is strong. But that's not always in the interests of the people. And in this country, there was a mass uprising in part because of the Rosatom nuclear deal that had been signed by Zuma as he was recovering from poisoning. And I think that's the critical question. Who wins, who loses, and will there be oversight from a citizenry? In the Central African Republic, for example, very questionable deals being done in the diamond sector using Russian mercenaries. Even 3 journalists were murdered suspiciously as they were looking into those. So let's just say that, like many relationships in Africa, what the leaders do, especially in relation to Moscow or the Western capitals too, may not be in the interests of the people.
So, Professor Bond, so this interest in Africa by foreign powers seems to be growing. Do you see that interest continuing and gaining momentum in years to come?
Oh yes, and it's very interesting now, especially with Donald Trump in a psychological way, because he's a racist, withdrawing from Africa. But the AFRICOM, the Africa Command, engaged in many battles, particularly against Islamic fighters. There are something like 24 major battles on, especially in Central Africa, the Sahel, and in the Horn. And it's there where you can see potentially Russians with their strong military capacities becoming, like we just saw in Syria, where the US moved out, Russia moves in. That could be a major factor. But I do think that now it's not just Russia. We've just had a big meeting between African leaders and the Japanese. We've had India and, of course, China every 3 years. And then there's the G20 meetings with African leaders and their compact with Africa. It does look like, even though the world demand for commodities from Africa is probably waning with the recession now looming, and with maybe votes in the United Nations not being so important. The Africans have never had a chance to sit permanently on the UN Security Council. Nevertheless, it's a new scramble for Africa, and Russia's definitely part of that.
Professor Patrick Bond joining us there from Johannesburg. Thank you. You're watching Africa Live. Still ahead on the program. Arrest warrants issued for General Khalifa Haftar and 3 commanders in Libya. And thousands are left homeless from flooding after a river bursts its banks in the CAR's capital, Bangui.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you all around the world. all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
British police say they have discovered 39 dead bodies in a truck container at an industrial estate east of London. The truck is believed to have come from Bulgaria through the Holyhead in Wales on Saturday. The truck driver is currently in police custody as inquiries into the incident continue. In Libya, a military court has issued an arrest warrant for Khalifa Haftar and 3 other retired commanders for commanding a Russian group that carried out kidnappings and murders. Haftar's forces launched a campaign in April to capture Tripoli from Libya's internationally recognized government of national accord. CGTN's Yasser Hakim with the details.
It's another chapter in the fight between the feuding factions in Libya. Haftar is accused of a spate of murders in September.
Libya is divided between the government of national accord led by Fayez al-Sarraj, and on the other side is the parliament and the Libyan National Army led by Khalifa Haftar. The arrest warrant is believed to be a political move against Haftar from the national accord to stop him from gaining more ground in the country.
Haftar and the National Army has launched a campaign earlier in the year to take over the capital of Tripoli. He says his army is trying to rid Libya of extremists and militias. He has the backing of the elected parliament and several international players.
Haftar is supported by most of the Arab countries that have been fighting terrorism, such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. In Europe, France has backed Haftar, while Italy has backed the government of national accord.
Haftar's military operation is rejected by the government of national accord. This is not the first arrest warrant against Haftar. The government of national accord has called for his arrest back in April, following an attack on an immigration center. But neither has been effective. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
And to the Egyptian capital, Cairo now, where there is growing concern about sexual violence against African migrants and refugee women. A growing number of them have been reporting abuse. Rights groups say the epidemic has worsened in recent months, jumping from 2 to 7 in a week.
I was assaulted. A boy used to come here every day and threaten me while my aunt was at work. One day he found me outside and took me in a tuk-tuk to Al Ashar neighborhood. He had some men with him. They took me to their house. It was full of Egyptians. He attacked me, put me on a bed and tied me to the bed.
It was a horrible scene, very horrible. He assaulted me, he touched me, after which I slapped him on the face. Immediately, around 4 other people came over, each one grabbing me from a different body part. I tried to defend myself, but how could I? There were 6. They all beat me until I passed out.
These women are part of a growing number of African migrants and refugees sexually abused during their stay in Cairo. They arrived here with the aim to reach Europe via Israel or by boat to Turkey.
Well, all women in Egypt are vulnerable. But if you are refugees, you go down to another new vulnerability of category because the whole system is not recognizing refugees, women in particular, so that it's socially and economically and politically it's not easy to have those women who's getting any kind of support. That's why you see the vulnerability, but the vulnerability can be everywhere since you are women. And it could be for men as well.
In 2017, an international perception poll named Cairo as the most dangerous megacity for women. The government imposed tougher sentences for sex crimes. But rights groups say such measures have done little to deter attacks.
There were few a week at that time. But quite quickly, and it coincided with the changes in the economy or the reform that the government has launched in early 2018, we noticed that there was an increase, which were more than like up to 1 a day. So from 2 to 3 a week, we were going to 7 a week. So it was quite a drastic increase.
The United Nations estimates around 500,000 migrants, half of them refugees, live in Egypt. Unlike Egyptian nationals, African migrants have no recourse to the police or family to protect them. They can only hope that these attacks will soon come to an end. Astatal, CGTN.
Let's now go to the Central African Republic, where thousands of people have been left stranded from flooding after a river burst its banks in Bangui. Local authorities now fear a health crisis could follow due to lack of sanitation and contamination of the river water by pollution from informal latrines. Let's take a look.
Residents in Bangui have been forced to wade in floodwaters for days after the banks of the river Ubangi burst last week. More than 6,000 people lost their homes, with some structures reported to have collapsed as a result of the calamity.
There are around 100,000 residents in the 6th district, according to the figures published in 2006. So now I think we can say 6,000 to 7,000 people are affected by this calamity.
In Bangui's District 6, seasonal flooding is expected, and many did not move out during this time as they were hopeful that the water would recede. However, heavy rains followed, worsening the situation.
It has been a week now that we are suffering. Our homes are flooded. Our children, we are in a very bad condition. We don't know where to go.
Here in the capital, more people remain at risk, especially those living next to the waterway. Informal latrines have overflown and polluted the river water.
You can see that here in Central Africa, and more specifically in District 6, that there is no collective sanitation. When you don't have collective sanitation, you end up with what we call individual sanitation, which is unregulated, and that means there's risk of waste contaminating the water table and the wells in which the people get water from. So the risk of illness is very high. The risk of malaria is a constant in District 6, but now we need to find solutions to get out of this situation.
Residents are calling for the health ministry to take urgent action before the floods lead to a cholera epidemic. Laura Walubengo, CGTN.
Meanwhile, the Ugandan government is concerned about the increasing rate of cesarean births in the country. The health ministry says the practice is common in private hospitals where health workers charge large amounts even when a mother could have had a natural birth. Surgical births have increased to 29% from 28% in 2018, according to the latest health sector review. CGTN's Isabel Nakiria reports.
Dorothy Hauha says a private hospital in Kampala extracted huge sums of money from her to pay for cesarean births. She has had 3 babies born by cesarean delivery and found it hard to raise the money. In all the 3 cases, she was told by doctors it was an emergency and she had no choice.
I chose to refuse, but they put some kind of harsh, and they told me we have to rush, and within a minute I was already in theater.
A cesarean birth in Uganda goes for about $1,000 in many private hospitals, a lot of money for an ordinary Ugandan. Medical practitioners say charges for cesarean births are a rip-off, and there is need for the government to put up legislation to regulate private hospitals. The health ministry is now questioning why surgical births are getting more common.
Generally, today, cesarean sections are safer, and because they are safer, they have been abused by both the medical people and the people who actually get these cesarean sections. It used to be that once a woman does antenatal care, she can be identified as a likely person to need a cesarean section. But many of these women do not actually go for antenatal care, only appearing when they are in labor.
Uganda's health ministry says many surgical births are unnecessary and could put both mother and baby at risk. Though the procedure is at times life-saving, doctors warn it could potentially cause dangerous side effects.
People have bled to death during cesarean sections or after cesarean sections. So one can easily die. The reason why doctors will first cross-match one's blood to make sure that if there is bleeding, one can be given blood. And it is not always 100% safe for one to have another person's blood.
Some women in Uganda have chosen cesarean births to reduce the pain or due to previous complications like hypertension that led to an emergency. The World Health Organization recommends prior counseling from a healthcare provider before a mother makes the decision to have surgery. Isabel Nakiria, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
And your business news coming up next. Here's what's ahead. A Brexit deal is on hold as UK lawmakers disagree on the timetable. And Zimbabwe needs $500 million to kickstart its platinum venture.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
British lawmakers have voted in favour of Prime Minister Boris Johnson's Brexit withdrawal agreement bill, but they rejected his timetable for passing the legislation ahead of the country's scheduled October 31st departure from the European Union. CGTN's Richard Bestick has more.
A bitter-sweet result for the UK Prime Minister. For the first time, parliamentary support for the principle of his Brexit deal, and then the bad news.
The ayes to the right, 308. The noes to the left, 322. So the noes have it, the noes have it.
Members of Parliament roundly rejected the speed at which he wanted to push through his deal. Defeated, the Prime Minister immediately got to his feet to announce that Brexit was being put on hold.
I will speak to EU member states about their intentions until they have reached a decision. Until they've reached a decision, I must say, we will pause this legislation. And let me be clear.
So Johnson's government and Brexit again thrown into chaos. With a matter of days before Britain crashes out of the European Union, no trading arrangements and little indication of what comes next. All eyes now on Brussels, where it's anticipated they will allow the UK more time. While there's a growing frustration within the EU at the 3.5 years of Brexit confusion, there's no enthusiasm to be seen as forcing a no-deal Brexit on Britain.
We should be ready for every scenario. But one thing must be clear. As I said to Prime Minister Johnson on Saturday, a no-deal Brexit will never be our decision.
Boris Johnson's parliamentary options then shutting down.
One choice, of course, is to engineer a general election fought along the lines of the people against Parliament, although under the British system that is quite difficult. However, it is looking ever more likely that Britain is moving towards a Christmas Brexit election. The only question being, what result will Santa be bringing? Richard Bestick, CGTN, London.
Well, the outcome of Great Britain's pending divorce from the European Union remains tortuously tough to predict. What are the possible scenarios ahead? A technical extension is one. Legislation passed last month states that unless Parliament backed a divorce deal by October the 19th, Prime Minister Boris Johnson must write to European Union leaders asking for a Brexit postponement of 3 months to January 31st, 2020. Johnson sent the letter and EU leaders are still considering their response. The technical delay would allow for a new parliamentary timetable to pass the legislation in the coming weeks. A longer delay is another scenario entirely. The European Union could offer Britain the option of a lengthier extension to give the country enough time to resolve its issues. A no-deal Brexit is also possible. EU leaders say that they would never cause a no-deal Brexit, but their decision to offer a delay must be unanimous. If any of the 27 member states opposes a delay, Britain would crash out of the bloc at the end of next week. Chilean President Sebastián Pinera has promised what he calls a new social contract with citizens. This comes after days of violent protests which have left 15 people dead. The demonstrations have exposed residents' grievances about the cost of living. CGTN's Owen Fairclough has more.
Demonstrators clashing with soldiers before another military curfew on the streets of Santiago. A public transport price rise has triggered days of deadly protests across Chile, but there are wider complaints.
What's happening has been going on for 30 years. We have issues on the pension funds, the queues in the clinics, waiting lists in hospitals, the cost of treatment, and low salaries.
We the people, the united people, will continue on the streets until Pinera either resigns, which will be ideal, or establishes a greater dialogue both with the opposition and with the people who are in the street.
Billionaire President Sebastián Pinera, elected for a second term in 2017 with a pro-business agenda, initially denounced the demonstrators. Now he's changed tack.
Hoy estamos trabajando en un conjunto de medidas.
Today we are working on a set of measures to potentially improve pensions, lower the price of medicines, reduce the waiting list and improve the quality of health care received by our compatriots.
Mejorar la calidad en la atención de salud.
Around half the country is under a state of emergency or curfew amid looting and arson. And as the protests have spread to neighbouring Buenos Aires and even to Paris, UN Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet, Pinera's predecessor, is calling for an independent investigation into the fatalities. Owen Fairclough, CGTN.
Protests in Lebanon have rendered the country locked down following the demands for new corrupt-free leaders. Sparked by a proposed tax on WhatsApp and other messaging applications, demonstrations have been ongoing despite the government's adoption of an emergency economic rescue plan. The country's cabinet recently announced wide-ranging economic reforms but failed to win over protesters. Various reforms have been proposed, including reduction of the 2020 budget deficit down to 0.6% of GDP, a privatization program, and slashing of lawmakers' salaries. Lebanon's economy has been sliding closer to the abyss in recent months due to the ballooning debt estimated at 150% of GDP.
We finished our studies and we don't want to leave our country to work abroad. This is why we took to the streets to ask many things, removing the bank's secrecy. However, this is not the only thing I ask for because I don't think that the parliamentarians have bank accounts in their own names. We should ask them from where they got all this money. We want them to pay back all the money they stole, and we want a lesser number of ministers in the cabinet.
I'm happy that the people are demonstrating because they are witnessing a destroyed infrastructure and the absence of social aid. Money is being wasted and we don't know where it's going. We deserve better than that.
The Russian Zimbabwean platinum venture Great Dyke Investment says it requires an additional $500 million to fund the first phase of its mining project in Harare. The firm is in advanced talks with Russian and South African lenders for syndicated financing. Zimbabwe hopes to revive the mining sector in efforts to drive recovery in an economy grappling with rolling power cuts and forex shortages. Production is expected to start in 2021 and is targeting 860,000 ounces per year. The government is seeking to exploit its reserves of platinum, which is used in catalytic converters to limit auto emissions. Vehicle manufacturers are also boosting production of electric cars powered by lithium batteries. Namibia's economy is set to shrink by 1.5% in 2019 after contracting 0.1% in the previous year. This is due to a broad slowdown triggered by severe drought, weak investment and falling consumer demand deepens. The country's finance minister says the economy will gradually recover to expand by around 0.8% in 2020 and 1.3% by 2021. Speaking during his midterm budget review speech, Kale Schweltein added that gross debt was seen remaining steady at just under 50% of gross domestic product. Nigeria generates an estimated 32 million tons of solid waste annually, one of the highest in Africa. Most of the waste comes from households and in some cases local industries, artisans as well as traders. Of this amount, only about 20 to 30% is collected, while the rest finds its way to sewers and drainage networks, causing serious environmental challenges. Now, one startup, EcoBata, is now running an incentive-based recycling scheme towards improving waste management and building healthier communities in the Nigerian capital. CGTN's Deji Badmos reports.
Bottles that we've collected from water companies.
Blessing Ekwere is at the heart of the operations at EcoBata, a waste collection startup she and a friend set up just last year. Their motivation is for a cleaner capital city, and it's thanks in part to their effort that Abuja is considered among the cleanest cities in Nigeria. Plastics are estimated to make up 2.5 million tons of the waste materials generated in Nigeria annually, and apart from Lagos, the bulk of the plastic waste are generated in Abuja.
Our scavengers usually go into dumps, households, and get all this around, and then we pile them up here until it's about, say, 2 to 3 tons before we move them to the companies that break them down for recycling.
Every day, scavengers contracted by EcoBata go around the city, collecting waste which are then brought to this facility for weigh-in and sorting.
We do door-to-door collections and make sure that even your food waste, the food waste still ends up in a controlled dump site. We also do buy-offs from big scavengers. We enter dumps and do buy-offs from them, collect their waste in bulk, and then transport it to the company for them for recycling. So far, since inception, we've been able to divert 100,000 kilograms of waste from landfills.
Through the EcoBata initiative, the scavengers now have a means of livelihood, and about 100 of them now work for EcoBata. At the end of every day's supply, the scavengers and Blessing hold a meeting where each scavenger's supply is calculated and entered into the farm's record for payment.
Part of the reasons we do this is to be able to earn a living to take care of ourselves and our families. But some of us are orphans. Nonetheless, they can be of assistance to their siblings or friends. In fact, what I earn from this trade in 2 weeks, even a top-ranking civil servant can't earn in a month.
For Ekwere and her colleague at EcoBata, the vision is to create an active and sustainable system that ensures environmental safety one community at a time. And despite the daunting challenge, they are forging ahead.
We need more finance to be able to run this at a larger scale. That's what we want. And then another challenge we have is the mindset, because we are not just about having guys go around to pick waste. We want people to see the importance of sorting their waste, and then so already we in Nigeria, we already have a mindset that it's waste. As long as it has been thrown away, it's away. So we want people to see that they capture value for their waste, and then indiscriminate dumping is a problem to them.
As the zero waste movement continues to spread across the globe, stakeholders and waste management companies like this are keen on intensifying campaigns to enlighten the general public on the need for proper disposal of solid waste. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Abuja, Nigeria.
And we still have more news for you here on the program. Here's what's ahead. We wine and dine with former South African radio personality Sandile, who is reimagining a new Africa through food.
Join us in Global Business and see Africa through our eyes. The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Kanata, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
And to South Africa now, where we meet up with former radio personality Sanza Sandile, who is reimagining a new Africa through food. Sanza's dinner club is situated in the heart of Yeoville in Johannesburg, a suburb also known to have the highest concentration of African diaspora in the city. CGTN's Brian Toussaint has more.
At the heart of Yeoville in Johannesburg inner city suburb sits Yeoville Dinner Club. The popular club is hosted by former radio personality Sanza Sandile, who has spent over a decade immersing himself in African cuisine. Sandile says he started the dinner club to embrace and promote Yeoville's Pan-African culture.
It's the only place where you see this mix of people, and now I'm happy to add these kind of people who found me through this social media because of the food and the stories and what I know, what I've earned. Living here, I'm putting together these dinners and they're amazing. And it's love for people, it's love for my neighborhood, and I'm just enjoying these times.
The restaurant's dining experience is also unique. Food is decked out on a long wooden table and everyone dines together in an open social space. Most diners say they always feel nostalgic whenever they come here.
Sansa's cooking made me feel good. Really amazing food. It tastes wholesome. And it feels good to actually have African cuisine that's, representative of who we are, where we come from, the way Sansa explained it. And it tastes amazing, so I felt really good about it.
The food is incredible, but it's incredible because you feel, or I feel like connected to people, and that's what makes food taste good, is when you're with good company and learning something and feeling just happy to be around other people.
The club is known to have the highest concentration of African diaspora in the city, with its busiest day being on Fridays, when guests stay longer sampling Sansa's favorite beers and wine after their meal.
We say Danish says cilantro.
Brian Toussaint, CGTN.
Your sports news coming up next. Here's what's ahead. Former Proteas skipper A.B. de Villiers remains optimistic despite a series whitewash against India.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
South Africa slumped to an innings and 202-run defeat in the third and final test against India in Ranchi to condemn the visitors to a 3-0 series whitewash. The series defeat has not gone down well with the South African public.